Hello, folks. Welcome to the Sense and Signal podcast with Jodah and Dan, where we talk about sense-making and leadership in organizations. And we have two frequent flyers coming back on the show, Jesan Sorrells and Zoe Fragou, who are both leadership consultants. And we're going to talk about Milan Kundera, the late novelist Milan Kundera, and what he can teach us about leadership and sense-making. So now that we got this episode in the can, Jodah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll say, I started off this episode reluctant, right? I'm not a Milan Kundera guy. I haven't read much of his stuff. I've read half a book, seen a movie. And so I was reluctant. I wasn't sure what value speaking about this gentleman who mostly writes about interpersonal relationships of people had to do with sense and signal,
Right.
which is we're talking about organizational dynamics. However, after an hour with you and Zoe and Jesan, my concerns were put to ease, right?
Yeah,
I
good.
mean, while he definitely does focus on interpersonal relationships, aren't organizations all about interpersonal relationships?
Oh, for sure.
Definitely, much of the lessons he teaches can be applied to the world of leadership and organizations.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, Kundera and other novelists can teach us a whole lot about sense-making and leadership. And we have an interesting discussion about that as well, which I thought was very fascinating.
Yeah, and I really liked how some of the areas that we approached around identity and power dynamics and history, right?
History. Yeah, and the whole idea of historical amnesia I thought was interesting, especially how it can apply to both political leadership and also leadership in the workplace. I thought that was also compelling.
Right. I thought so as well. Yeah.
And then the debate between ideology and imagology. We'll define those terms later in the episode, but that's also interesting.
I won that debate.
I
think I won that debate.
I won that debate, sir, as you will see when you watch the episode. And then we culminate with Zoe Fragou sharing her story about getting canceled by Greek nationalists on TikTok. So that's something to look forward to as well.
Definitely interesting. Yeah.
So
cultural differences.
Definitely learned a lot about Greece in this episode. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's something for everybody in this episode. So keep watching, hit the subscribe button, and make sure to leave some comments in the comment section below.
And most of all, enjoy yourselves, people. We'll see you there.
When we want to give expression to dramatic situations in our lives, we tend to use metaphors of heaviness. We say that something has become a great burden to us. We either bear the burden or fail and go down with it. We struggle with it, win or lose. And Sabina, what had come over her? Nothing. She had left a man because she felt like leaving him. Had he persecuted her? Had he tried to take revenge on her? No. Her drama was a drama not of heaviness, but of lightness. What fell to her lot was not the burden, but the unbearable lightness of being. Milan Kundera. I'd like to start out. What's your favorite Milan Kundera novel, and what did it teach you about leadership?
First of all, I love all of his books, and I've read most of his books. But if I have to choose the one that actually affected and influenced my leadership style and how I treat business and how I treat my career, I will have to go with The Joke. And the reason is, definitely The Joke. And the biggest lesson I got from The Joke is that pettiness doesn't only destroy lives, but it also stalls your career. Because basically it's a book about a person who, he got wronged. Yeah, but then he held a grudge. So his entire life was about planning a revenge. And then when he finally got his revenge, he realized that something that for him meant so much, and being petty and holding to this hate and holding to this revenge, for everyone else it meant nothing. And all the others had moved on. They had a different life. They were in different situations. But he was still mentally there. And that for me was amazing at that point. I realized that it doesn't matter if somebody has wronged you. You probably would never make them understand. But if it is to make them understand, it should be with your actions. And it should be by taking the higher road and just moving forward and focusing on yourself and your work.
Nice. Hey, Son. I like it.
So I will admit, I was only introduced to Milan Kundera a couple of years ago, which is a tragedy. But right along with Václav Havel and a lot of those other writers, as we began to explore on the podcast, my own podcast, the the vagaries of totalitarian and tyrannical nightmares. And so I'm a big fan of The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I had heard about that book, obviously, before, but I never really had an opportunity to get a hold of it. And the lesson that I learned from that book that can apply to leadership, it really applies to our conversation today, maybe Jodah can take something from this as well, is the acidity of moral weakness. And so
Jodah needs to learn about the acidity of moral weakness. That's for sure. I can testify.
You know me too well, Hasan.
And that's what this book is about. It's about two people who are basically cheating on each other, but they are inside of a system of lies. They're inside a system of lies that, much like Václav Havel, the greengrocer puts up the sign that says "Workers of the World Unite," but he doesn't care about the workers of the world, and he doesn't care if they unite or not. He just wants to sell apples. And so why is he putting up that sign? Well, he's putting up that sign because he's participating in lies in the culture. And when you participate in lies in the culture, that leads all the way down to the substructure of individual interactions. And that was one of the key insights that Kundera had, that I think ranks him along with Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And even, I would even say, we most recently read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He's in that order of authors who really understood the corrosive power of lies. And again, the acidity of moral weakness.
Yeah. For me, I like, my favorite is Immortality, which was released in 1990, at least in the United States. And what I learned from that, there's a lot I've learned from that, and I've actually been rereading it or listening to it to prepare for this podcast. And I love going back to books because you forget. I've read a lot of Milan Kundera. I've read The Joke. I've read the Book of Laughter and Laughter and Forgetting, and also, of course, Unbearable Lightness of Being. And he says in Immortality, he should have actually titled Immortality The Unbearable Lightness of Being at one point in the book. But when rereading it recently, he introduces this concept called imagology, which is kind of a variation or a play on ideology that I think is a fascinating concept that I'd like to talk about later in this podcast. Because when I was reading it, it got me to thinking about King Solomon's old phrase from Ecclesiastes, that there's nothing new under the sun, right? And we think things are different now because we have social media and the internet. But a lot of the things that we feel like are impacting our society in those spheres, he's talking about in immortality. And so it's kind of a thread that kind of ties modernity together. So, and I also just really appreciate the poetry of his book. I think he pushes back against being a psychological writer, but he has a depth of thought that he brings to his fiction and a philosophical point of view, which I agree with. And of course, that is rooted in his experience living in Czechoslovakia during the Russian occupancy or the Soviet Union occupancy. So how about you, Jodah? What's your favorite Milan Kundera book?
All right. I will start off by saying my first introduction to Milan Kundera is much different than any of yours. My 10th grade year, I ditched the entire year. I didn't want to go to school. I will not say that I was so bright that it bored me. Although I was bored, but I don't think it was because I was so bright. I lived a very Southern California lifestyle for a year with my friends, and we'd go to the beach.
Were you a beach bum, Jodah?
I would do all sorts of things.
I bet.
And we were, how old? 10th grade. Figure out what that age. I don't remember. And that was a time when they introduced the thing where they'd call your house at the end of every day. So I have to be home at a particular time to catch the phone call. It was a whole thing, but more trouble than it probably really was worth for that year. But I got busted. And we were in the room with my counselor, who kind of, who oversees a certain set of the student body. And I just remember him saying to my father, he goes, Doug, I think the problem here with Jodah is he's having a crisis with an unbearable lightness of being. And I never, my dad looked at me like, wow, what a great phrase. I'm like, well, so very wise counselor, but he also turned out to be an a-hole. But I think looking back with what I know about Milan, and I would say he was probably correct. Fast forward a couple of years, I did go see the movie with my father, probably because of that.
Milan Kundera hated that movie, by the way.
Did he? Okay, yeah. Well, and I wouldn't say I liked it that much either, honestly. But I was also, again, it was probably above my head. Wasn't the right age. I wasn't in the right headspace. I didn't think it was horrible, but I just,
Actually, he wrote Immortality, I think. He has a passage in Immortality where he talks about writing novels to make sure that they can never be adapted into movies.
Yeah, that's
how much it scarred him.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of, right. Well, maybe he should have had other movies. Yeah. So anyways, with that said, my experience with Milan is very limited. I started to read Unbearable Lightness of Being, since there seems to be the connection in my life there. I probably got a third of the way through it. I am picking up on the themes that you guys are talking about. I remember I called Dan. I go, Dan, I think he's an existentialist. And Dan's all, yeah, bro. I'm like, okay, all right. So I got to catch up with this guy. So I think that's kind of how we're kicking off this episode, guys.
Well, you
I
have
care about
Jodah.
This show is about sense making. This show is about leadership. This show is about trying to keep that shit interesting. And I want to know why the hell I should give a damn about Milan Kundera, and what does he mean for
so
society, and organizations, and leaders? Like, what am I gaining?
Come on,
I'm not seeing this as value to society.
Because Dan, can I help you out? Let me help you out here. Let me jujitsu this man here a little bit. Look, Jodah, the reason you should care about
skepticism out of him.
Well, I'm gonna cuddle it out of him very gently.
Cuddle it.
And I think Zoe would agree with me about this. Kundera was obsessed with the idea of what type of people are created by the situations and circumstances they are in, if there is an absence of the transcendent. And we've talked about this on the podcast before with you guys, right? So we used to make sense, and I loved how Dan framed it in terms of modernity. We used to make sense of the world through Christianity. Nietzsche killed all that. Okay, fine. How do you make sense now? Well, Kundera was consumed with that, and he was layering that underneath the ideology of communism, which claimed that it could make sense without God. And he fundamentally didn't buy that. And that's, by the way, why he might have been a collaborator. He might have been a little bit of a shady gangster. Because if you're in a system that's built on lies, like I talked about with Unbearable Lightness of Being, then you're automatically living underneath a tyranny. And tyrannical times create weak men, and then weak men lead other people weakly. And so what do you get? You just got weakness everywhere, and no one has any moral strength, right? And Kundera, I believe, was obsessed with that. And you can see that in some of his other works, like The Joke, where you're talking about grudges. I mean, why am if I can't let go of a grudge, that means I'm holding on to something that's giving me meaning in a world that is meaningless.
How about you, Zoe? How are you going to convince Jodah that reading Milan Kundera will enlighten him about leadership and sense making?
Well, for starters, I'm going to tell you one lesson that he taught me, that he said so clearly, that I think that if everyone could actually grasp this lesson and actually understand it and learn it, then their careers and their leadership style would be so much more successful. So in one of his books, he said that when you ask someone what they like and what they don't, you shouldn't take into consideration their answers based on what really they like or not, but only as to assess, based on their value system, what they think that they should like and that they should want. So basically what he said is that you can't know if they do like or not like what they tell you, and you shouldn't care about that, but it shows you a lot about their values and their belief system. It shows you where they think their values should be based and what they think is important. So it doesn't give you information about them, but it does give you information about how you should be towards those people in order to gain their trust. If that's not a leadership lesson, then I don't know what it is. I rest my case. Like, so many people, they work in corporation, it takes them forever, and they don't understand a single thing. They say, but this person told me that. And then you have to ask them, what about their actions? If you don't focus on what they said, and if you don't focus on what you think they should say, and you actually focus on their daily behaviors, the only thing that's real, what message do you get from that?
Right. The only thing that's real in a society and culture where talk is cheap and increasingly cheaper and cheaper over the course of the 20th century, during which time Milan was living and working. And you really have to look at his background, right? So, like, he was not a person who, well, let's put it this way. Actions matter more than speech because words are a dime a dozen. Everybody can say stuff. Blah, 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 blah. We could popcorn on that all day. But, Dan, what are you actually going to do when the chips are down? What is Jesan going to do when the chips are down? What's Zoe going to do when the chips are down? So talk is cheap.
Yeah. And another thing that I find interesting is how Milan always, in every book he made, he found a way to deconstruct the interpretation of people's motivations in order to show you that this thing that this protagonist, interpreted like that, how different it is in real life. And that's also a big lesson we get, that every time you dive into someone's motivation, you basically lose track from reality. For example, I remember I think it was a Goodbye Valse, but again, I'm translating back from Greek, so maybe in English the title of the book is different. So there was this girl, and she was very promiscuous, so she had a lot of lovers, etc. And there was this super playboy guy, and she refused to sleep with this guy. And in his mind, he explained this decision as a very charming decision, because he said that basically she's doing me a favor, because that's how she shows how important I am. She sleeps so easily with everyone else, but me, who I'm so special, she doesn't want to sleep with because I'm so special.
Right.
And
we all want to make
That sounds like a male reversal. way to reverse rejection, bud. All right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, so many people do that, don't they? They get rejected and they find a way to feel good about it. They get on the other side, someone tells something good and they say, no, they just try to manipulate me. It's not really genuine. So what he wants to show you is that if you go that rabbit hole, you're lost. You will never know. Just focus on yourself, what you want to take. Otherwise, everything else is just for laughs.
Well, okay, but don't you become a tyrant with yourself, though? Like, you become a tyrant with yourself and a tyrant with each other when you sort of descend into that. And I always got the sense from Kundera's work that he was kind of, I wouldn't say tongue-in-cheek about it, but he wasn't all that serious.
He wasn't.
Picking up on something there? Yeah, okay. All right. It's a little tongue-in-cheek
I
there.
think that for me, it's the opposite of what you say. It's not about becoming a tyrant. If anything, I think that all of his books and all of his work is about taking life less seriously and taking yourself less seriously and being a little bit not cynical in the Bukowskian way, but more cynical in this is life. It's bad. It's bad for all of us. Let's admit that we all suffer. The last thing we can do and the least we can do is laugh about it. That's all. Right. Let's find a way and laugh all together about how hard and how zero sense it's making, to leave it.
And I want to throw my weight in to try and convince Jodah that looking at Milan Kundera and all literature is important, from a leadership perspective. And I think both Jesan and Zoe, we've talked about this on other podcasts as well, podcast episodes as well, that I think in terms of leadership, we can think about systems, we can read books, textbooks on leadership and transformational leadership and looking at behaviors. But I think kind of getting back to think about the Greeks and Plato and the Greeks, I'm thinking at Zoe, and Plato and Aristotle, and the idea of the wise leader and the worldly leader. Like, reading literature gives you a broader perspective about humanity and gives you some of that empathy. And I think what Milan Kundera also brings is a philosophical framework, an existential philosophical framework to kind of make sense of what's happening in the world. Because again, nothing's new under the sun. I mean, we're seeing the same patterns because we're all human beings. We're just different generations dealing with different technology. And you can go back and look at a book like Immortality from 1990 and say, wow, I can map themes from that book to Zoe getting canceled, which we'll talk about later in this episode, on Greek Twitter. I can map those themes. So I think looking at literature and looking at good writers like Milan Kundera, who are deep, thoughtful writers, can broaden your way of thinking about the world, and that will make you a more effective leader. So did we convince you, Jodah?
Well, I'll respond to that and say I think Jesan had a follow-up to what you just said, I feel like.
I think, yeah, I did have a follow-up, and this is my only follow-up. And then I'm waiting with bated breath. My breath is literally bated to see what Jodah would say. Which is rare for me. My breath is almost never bated. I breathe just fine. But I'm
sure you're going to be very disappointed.
Kundera's work overlaps with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work. So he wrote 100 Years of Solitude. That's his most famous work. Marquez was trying to do the same thing, but in a Latin American context, and trying to do it with magical realism, which comes again out of that very specific Latin American context. And you're seeing these writers who are responding to the mid-20th century dynamics of the Cold War. And what's interesting to me as an amateur historian is, and I think Zoe's probably about 15 years younger than I am, if I may be so generous. People who are a little bit younger than me, they don't know the Cold War. They just don't know. We don't teach it in America anymore. It's one tiny paragraph in an 8th grade textbook and then everybody sort of moves on. You know, we go World War II, which, by the way, composes of Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the bomb getting dropped on Japan, because Oppenheimer's coming out in the next couple of days.
Tomorrow.
And then we go
I'm doing Barbie and Oppenheimer.
During Barbenheimer. All right, awesome. Good, yeah. Good. The Barbenheimer doubleheader. And then we have a paragraph on communism, and then we jump right to the World Trade Center, and we're done. Like, Zoe may not know this because she's in Greece, and so I don't know how Greek students are taught, but in America, nobody under the age of, I would say nobody under the age of 35 really knows anything about the Cold War. And so I worry that authors like Marquez, Kundera, this is where my concern is, those types of authors who are writing in very specific cultural and historical contexts will be forgotten. And so it's worthwhile to read them so that their lessons are not forgotten. Because to Dan's point, there is no new thing under the sun. And then you'll have the challenge, I think, is you'll have those very same people who've never read those books or never heard of those authors or never had those experiences historically. They will show up in the mid-21st century again, because tyrants always show back up again and they always try to reassert themselves. So, Jodah, go ahead.
I hear that 100%. Yes. I have nothing you said I would disagree with. I mean, obviously, we need to keep history front and center. And there's plenty of quotes about that. What is it? What's that famous Mark Twain line? It rhymes or something like that. You know,
yeah.
You know, so that's a fact. But I'm kind of ensconced in this Milan Kundera, as Dan called it, skepticism. I'm not so skeptic of what I've read and what I've read about him. I'm confident this man had his thumb on a certain psychological, philosophical pulse of modern world. But I do want to I heard some themes there. One was that there is a focus on trying to rationalize yourself against what is perceptibly outside of yourself chaos of decision-making of other people. Like it becomes utterly impractical to completely judge your decision-making processes against your perception of the whys of other people, because you're never going to get there, possibly because they don't even know why they've done what they've done. So really, you need to focus on your own decision-making. Did I hear that correctly, Zoe? Was that kind of, or am I bastardizing that? Am I summarizing?
Basically, not just the decision-making, but also the interpretation of their behavior, the interpretation of their motivation. Focus on what's happening. That's the only thing you know, the actual facts of the situation. And then focus on yourself and your demands of every relationship. Like you mentioned, the unbearable lightness of being. This is a book about how not having a clear demand from a specific relationship can ruin both your life and the other person's life. You see these people that in a sense, they live for each other, but they forget to live for themselves. And then they get entangled into lying and ethical skepticism and this moral, trying to hold a moral ground. But what moral ground? Like you said, they didn't want to be together. And then they were both staying for the relationship for the sake of each other. No one just asked. No one just went there and say, hey, are you sure you want to do it? And both of them thought that the other person is too weak to sustain a breakup.
Mhm.
How many people are finding themselves in these situations? And then we think about work. I know for a fact, because that's what I'm an organizational psychologist. So when we talk about the secrets at work, I know all of them. That's what they do. They tell me everything. So that always you go and there's this person who tells you, I should leave this company, but they wouldn't sustain one day without me. I just stay for them because it's the best for them and for my team. And then you ask the boss and they say, I want to send them away. I want to fire them, but I feel sorry because I don't think they will find a better job at this age.
Right. Historical amnesia. Today, history is no more than a thin thread of the remembered, stretching over an ocean of the forgotten. But time moves on, and an epoch of millennia will come, which the inextensible memory of the individual will be unable to encompass. Whole centuries and millennia will therefore fall away. Centuries of paintings and music, centuries of discoveries, of battles, of books. And this will be dire, because man will lose the notion of his self and his history, unfathomable, unencompassable, will shrivel into a few schematic signs, destitute of all sense. Milan Kundera, The Joke.
Right. And one thing, a theme I heard through this initial part of the conversation too, is this idea of historical amnesia, right? And I think Jesan was bringing it up in terms of, in the West, or at least in the United States, not teaching students enough about the Cold War era, so it becomes a distant memory to them. Zoe, in Greece, what is being taught about the Cold War? Because I think that also really informs Kundera's work. You can't really understand Kundera without understanding that he was in Czechoslovakia. Okay. He was part of the Communist Party. He left the Communist Party because of Stalinism and the extremes of Stalinism. And that many of his books, what intrigued many readers about his books in the 1980s when he became popular, was how foreign the world he created in his novels were to Americans, because they didn't really understand it. But I imagine that's pretty different maybe in Greece and Eastern Europe where you're at.
Okay. So I wanted to avoid this question, but since you put me on the spotlight, I'm going to tell you something that's going to shock all of you. So in
Are you going to get us canceled?
I look forward to being shocked. I would love to be shocked. Please shock me. Go ahead. I'm ready. Shock me.
So in Greece, we don't learn any foreign history. We spend 12 years of having history every single year, like 3 to 4 times per week. And we only learn our own history and nothing else from our own Christian Orthodox perspective and nothing else. So we spend like ancient Greek years, and then we move to Persian, and then we move like to Byzantium and Roman history, and then to Turks and Turkocracy, and pretty much up to what's happening right now, but not even one chapter about what happens anywhere else in the world.
So did Greek youth know anything about the Soviet Union or have an understanding of what that entity was?
No.
Wow.
Some of them,
damn.
like from the movies. We only have the American perspective from the movies when we watch like Captain America and movies like that. So we do know. I tell you this: if you go,
and Captain America is super accurate. That is like a documentary.
And grab random Greek person in Athens, let's say, and ask them about when was World War II over. Maybe most probably they won't have any idea, because we just focus on when Turks left the country, what happened inside, and then events like Hiroshima, Nagasaki. You will find endless Greeks that have no idea what this is.
Wow.
Because
so that
we never
does
learn.
really bring up the idea of historical amnesia, because I think to channel Milan Kundera, I think, and what he's saying in many of his books is that that's a political act to erase history so that people don't have those reference points, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just had a, and I know this is not a podcast that focuses on history or geopolitics, but I just had like a geopolitical click go over in my head, because for years I've never understood why the Greeks and the Turks are still locked in like anything. Like what do you care? Like things have moved on.
Don't forget the Armenians.
Oh, and and the Armenians. Let's throw them in there, right? They're coming off the ring, in off the high ropes,
like in Turkey,
like in a wrestling match.
Talk about the Armenians,
actually,
but like that's amazing.
It's been conserved 100% from both ends. All this history, like I'm sure from the Turkish perspective, Greece is just one more country under Turkish occupation among endless other European and Asian countries that were under Turkish occupation. But from the Greek perspective and the way we've been taught of this history in schools, it's like we were this super great nation with this great history. And by the way, in our books, the way it's portrayed, it's like we jump from the ancient Greek years to the Turkish occupation, which of course is not true. We have nothing to do with those people anymore. And that's also a result of why there is so much nationalism in Greece right now, up to this day. And that goes back to how I got cancelled on TikTok, by the way.
So let's go tell that story.
Jodah, you didn't bait my breath. She baited my breath. I'm going to be quiet.
She's a breath baiter.
I'm going to be quiet for the next 5 minutes now. I got to absorb that. Like I got to absorb that. Okay.
Dan, before we get into that story, because I like to set it a little, because that is a good story she's going to tell. I'd like to just explore this concept just a little bit more on another level. So you just described that's institutionalized amnesia, right? That's bonking people over their head and making them forget something. Like you're structuring a system to eradicate. But Dan and I were also talking about non-institutional social amnesia as well, right? That it can kind of happen up through natural processes. And the example I was talking to Dan about it the other day, which I thought was interesting because there was no nefariousness in this, is that age takes a toll on your ability of social memory. I've been around we'll say a million years, and I've seen cycles. And those
dinosaurs were roaming the earth.
Yes, dinosaurs. There's pictures of me on dinosaurs, and so
there's a pterodactyl.
I've been on, and so I've seen cycles. I've been around enough to see a cycle, see several cycles, and that then writes it makes an impression in my brain, and then I have a memory. Oh, I know what's going to happen from that result. Sometimes we'll get in my work in various places. We'll have like people who are just fresh out of college. They have not seen these cycles, and so they'll be making decisions based upon whatever little mini cycle they've seen against this broader sort of thing. And sometimes if you have a very youthful run company, the memories of people who perhaps, let's say, saw the 2008 crash or the 2001 crash or whatever, those are lost to them. They're anecdotal and maybe not even known. And you can see them actually making the new mistakes. So there seems to be sort of an aspect to amnesia that occurs just through, again, not through nefarious reasons, but through just the order of growth in humanity and age cycles to some degree. I took your breath away. I baited your breath.
Thank you, Jodah, for this note.
I'm combining everything together in my head right now. I'm coming up with a theory of reality.
I can relate to this from a higher ed perspective. You know, you have new teachers come into the institution. They don't have the institutional memory. And they, think, oh, I'm going to change everything. And I'm going to do this radical thing that's going to change how students learn. And it's like, yeah, we already tried that 10 years ago. We can try it again. But they don't have the institutional memory to know what's been tried before, and you see it generationally and with kids going back to the Cold War and the idea communism might be a great thing. It just hasn't been done the right way. But my generation's going to do communism the correct way, and so let's go pursue socialism and communism because they don't have the memories of the Cold War and what happened then.
Well, and there's also there's also a second order function of this. And I'm now I'm collapsing everything together in my head. Thank you, Zoe and Jodah. Everything is collapsing now in my head. So this is good. So now I can actually talk coherently, I think. I think we're also missing another aspect of this when we talk about that idea of cycles or historical amnesia or very specific institutionalized amnesia. And I work with a lot of organizations, just to make this very relevant to leadership, where the people who had all of the wisdom, not the knowledge, because knowledge you can get off of Google. Who cares about knowledge these days? But wisdom you can't get off of Google. So I can find all kinds of data, statistics, facts, blah, 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 to do my job about whatever project it is I want to launch. But the wisdom to launch it, that goes going out the door encased in a human body that's called, euphemistically, a baby boomer. And we're going to punt that guy to the sidewalk and hire somebody else who's younger, cheaper, and has energy, but has zero wisdom. And so I work a lot of times with organizations to take that wisdom that's in, quite frankly, people with gray hairs heads, take that information out of their head and put it in a database somewhere so that the shiny, happy new people can go access that wisdom. We really have a wisdom deficit in our, and we always have in the West. That's actually probably one of our greatest Achilles heels. And one of our greatest gifts
about
too.
That. He talks about that in Immortality. The analogy he says is like, and he talks about this in terms of values, right? Like, if you are in a situation and you have to, there's a character in the book who's a female, and there's a situation where they're being confronted by soldiers, and the mother has to choose which child to save, and she chooses her youngest child because that's a Western value. The youngest gets priority. The younger you are, the more value you have. And then he kind of, as he does, extrapolates that philosophically and looking at Western values and says, well, if you're old, you have the least amount of value, and then when you're dead, you're gone, right? You're nothing. So, and I've seen this in other trainings on intercultural training. Like if you talk to somebody from the East, for instance, from Asian countries, it's flipped, right? If you are from an Asian country, the thought experiment is if you are in a raft and the raft is sinking and you can save your grandmother or your child, you're going to save your grandmother because of the wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. And because in that culture, it's more valued. So there's a lot to that.
I think that's controversial. Dan, that might get us canceled. We'll see, though.
I want to be canceled like Zoe.
So do we want Dan? Do we want to? Should we go into Zoe's story?
We should, because I think that'll bring us to So we've kind of tackled a little bit about the theme of historical amnesia, and I think we can concede that it's a thing, and it can. I think from a leadership perspective, it's also a dangerous tool because you could use it to manipulate people by removing history so that they don't have the reference points to make sense in decisions.
I have a counterpoint to that, but I'll wait until after Zoe proceeds.
Okay. So Zoe, you got canceled. I'm going to use this as a transition into the idea of Milan Kundera's theme of imagology, which is a counterpoint to ideology, right? So, and he'll say, like, in Immortality, he talks about you have ideology, which is kind of being captured by certain ideas or a certain framework of ideas, but that reality will always trump ideology. But when you get into the world of imagology, which is focused on the image, design, advertising.
Dan, I'm going to pause you there real quick. Remember, I'm not a Milan guy. I don't know why or where he's coming from. Why does he say reality will always trump ideology? Because I would have I actually don't believe that. Why would he say that? Okay.
That's something I say all the time too. You might have a certain framework about how you think the world's going to work, but it's going to run up against reality at some point. I
got to agree with Jodah on this one.
I think you're both wrong.
I got to agree, but I got to agree with Jodah on this one. I think we are at a specific cultural inflection moment, and Jodah knows what I'm about to say. This will get us canceled, where we have people who are claiming things about the fundamental nature of reality that just are signs of mental illness. Sorry. Like, if I go out into the rain, I'm going to use a very easy example here. If I go out into the rain and get wet, water is still wet. I could identify as dry all day long. I'm still wet. And if I demand that you all identify me as dry when water is wet, I'm saying something about deconstructing the fundamental nature of reality. That's an ideology. That's where we're at right now in the West.
And let me reduce that to even a smaller tale of psychology, which says that humans are rationalists. We don't look at evidence and easily and say, "Hey, I'm going to change my rationale." We rationalize the evidence to against what we already believe. I think Zoe just was making some comments earlier that we will justify things against our current belief systems, regardless of what, we will make sure it fits into our.
I can imagine the wall's not there, but if I'm speeding into the wall, as much as I imagine the wall's not there, I'm going to crash into it and die, right? And that's what I mean by, you can have whatever ideology or belief system you want.
Yeah.
If it really doesn't conform to reality, you're running into a wall that you're not going to like at some point.
Yeah, when Kundera speaks about reality getting stamped by ideas, he doesn't really mean general reality. I think he means your specific reality. And he means a person's reality that is so limited by their beliefs and their ideology. That's what's going to be crushed by different ideas. Because every person, they grow up in a specific system. Like, for example, we talked about Greece before. You talk about World War II, for example. In Greece, we grew up to think that for some reason, there was German occupation at one point. We didn't have the context of what was happening through our books. We just thought that at one point, Germans attacked Greece and there was German occupation. That was it. What was happening to the rest of the world? No. So then, this is my reality. And I have so many things to back it up because I actually learned it in school by my significant others, which is my, the place of concern where I am.
But I want you to frame out a little bit more because I want to understand this distinction that you're drawing inside of Kundera's work between general versus specific reality. Like, can you frame that out a little bit more? Because you read more.
The thing is that every person believes their reality to be their reality, but it's not their reality; it's your reality. And I think that that's what he's trying to show with every single book. For that man who said that this woman doesn't want to sleep with him because he's so special, and that's her way of honoring his being special, it's real, his reality. We shouldn't, there is a big distinction. We always think that people are full of shit. And maybe they are, but it's not necessarily because they're trying to bullshit you. Most of the times, they're just bullshitting themselves. And it's not real that they know. That's another thing. I'm a psychologist, and all the time people tell me they have to know. No, they really don't. They really don't know. They really think that's the reality. And that's what gets crushed. Something that I like to say is that I make fun that when I was younger, and I say life hadn't crushed my self-love in my self-love and my ambition in my face yet. That's exactly what I mean. You still think that your personal reality, which is actually your perspective of reality, is the only reality there is. And for me, that's what was life-changing about Kundera. That's the thing.
Imagology. This word finally lets us put under one roof something that goes by so many names. Advertising agencies, political campaign managers, designers who devise the shapes of everything from cars to gym equipment, fashion stylists, barbers, show business stars dictating the norms of physical beauty that all branches of imagology obey. All ideologies have been defeated. In the end, their dogmas were unmasked as illusions and people stopped taking them seriously. For example, communists used to believe that in the course of all capitalist development, the proletariat would gradually grow poorer and poorer. But when it finally became clear that all over Europe workers were driving to work in their own cars, they felt like shouting that reality was deceiving them. Reality was stronger than ideology, and it is in this sense that imagology surpassed it. Imagology is stronger than reality, which has anyway long since ceased to be what it was for my grandmother who lived in a Moravian village and still knew everything through her own experience. Imagologues create systems of ideals and anti-ideals, systems of short duration which are quickly replaced by other systems, but which influence our behavior, our political opinions, and aesthetic tastes. The color of carpets and the selection of books, just as in the past, We have been ruled by the system of ideologues. Excerpts from Milan Kundera's Immortality.
The thing.
So let's map this back over to your recent cancellation, Zoe, because it deals with ideology, right? And Greek nationalism. And so, which is an ideology. And it's obviously shaping those individuals' perception of reality. So what happened? How did you get canceled and what was the result?
Well, I didn't really get canceled. I got bullied. It's not exactly the same. I got bullied online. What happened is that I gave an interview, a Greek interview in a Greek podcast, and the interview went great, actually. I even got like leads and clients from it and a lot of new followers and positive feedback. But in one of the small clips that were promoting the episode and was uploaded on TikTok by the journalist, I was speaking Greek, but I actually used a lot of English words to describe specific concepts and definitions that are much easier to describe in English than in Greek. Because, by the way, there are many words like concept, for example, or coach that we don't really have as concept in Greek. Therefore, it's much easier to explain them in English. And the amount of negative comments I received for speaking English and polluting our beautiful language. And they even said I'm not educated and I shouldn't have an opinion. And how dare I use English when we have the most beautiful language in the world? It was insane. I couldn't believe it. And how they talked about me, the words they used. And what I was saying before is that I'm a psychologist. I'm not like an artist. I'm not used to that. It was insane for me to just go in and seeing all these people saying that I shouldn't have an opinion and how dare I, and I'm not Greek enough. And I also, yeah. And another thing, they said like, what is she trying to do? Does she think it's important because she uses English words and she's just, basic and she can't speak proper Greek. And even if we give her a dictionary, she wouldn't be able to find the Greek words in there, stuff like that.
Is Greeklish a common spoken language in Greece? I
mean, that's good, Jodah. Like that.
Well, because I know in India they have, I think it's called there's a mash of English and Hindi, and it's like English or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there might be there's a Greeklish quotient too.
There is there is insane amount of Greeklish. But what was interesting for me, there were two things. One thing was that the lack of empathy, in the sense of everyone assumed that the reason I speak so much English is because I want to look important, that I speak English. And no one thought that, like, even if you check my own TikTok, all of the content is in English. So the thing is that 99% of my clients are American. Therefore, I speak English nonstop. And my partner is Swedish. Therefore, I'm actually not used to using this terminology in Greek in my normal life. So my business language is English. So it's much more easier. It had nothing to do with everything it said. It's just that I just don't speak Greek anymore so much. That's it. And the second thing that was crazy for me was that by now, we all know how social media algorithms work, right? We all know that the more like haters,
amp it up.
The more traction. Exactly. So I was like, do they know they actually support me? The only reason this video got viral and I got so many new clients is because they put a pause in their lives to just write 1,000 words saying that I don't know anything. And I was like, they support me and they're just confused. Like, they're supporters, but they're confused about it. Confused supporters.
Cognitive dissonance.
101. You know, hug your haters. That's what you got to do. You just got to. You can say that in English too. I say I'm going to hug my haters. they'll love that. They'll love that. Well, okay. So I'm interested in something. If you don't mind, Dan and Jodah, I'd like to ask Zoe a question here, because I'm fascinated by sort of how this works in a cultural context that's so totally outside of my own. The French believe their language is beautiful and that it cannot be watered down. The Greeks believe their language is beautiful and cannot be watered down. And yet, the dominant language, quite frankly, for business, to your point, is English. There's a lot of not only cultural, but psychological and dissonance there. And this actually, I think, ties into that historical amnesia thing you were talking about, the way people are educated, right, in high school. So are you surprised by the behavior, or were you just surprised by the virulence of it, by the speed with which it got to you? Like, which one was more surprising, the speed or the behavior?
I'm just sad that there's so much ignorance and people are so afraid of change that it's so much easier for them to believe that the world is going to stop from changing than actually find a way to adapt. And this doesn't only go to language. It goes to informatics. It goes to everything. We had recently with Jodah and Dan the same discussion about social media and how everyone was in the beginning of social media like demonizing them and be like, they're gonna know it's not gonna be a big thing and they're ruining lives. And the same thing happens now to AI. As if the fact that you're scared and the fact that it's gonna change what you know is gonna stop the evolution from whatever evolution is. The thing is that Greek is such a hard language. And by the way, my Greek, I think it's above average, according to everyone who speaks Greek.
Right.
In general. The thing is that it's a very hard language. It could never be. And by the way, French, I also speak French and I also speak German and English. So the thing is that French is also a very difficult language. These languages are so difficult, they will never be business languages. English is such an easy language. And then at the same time, if you add to it that the States is a very big country, and if you add to the mix also English colonization, it makes perfect sense that English is the global language.
Did you just say English is an easy language?
It is a very easy language.
Oh,
I've heard that before. Yeah, from non-English speakers. Oh, yeah.
It's an amazing easy language. It's a very easy language.
Okay.
Are you kidding me? It's like if you can.
We struggle with it here. It's the dominant language here. We struggle with it here. We can barely speak it ourselves. So
that's right. It's not exactly. Maybe we know too much. Yeah, no. I found Spanish to be actually a very easy language, and it compared to English. So, but whatever. Yeah.
But the thing is that like languages like Greek and French, they're objectively difficult. And another thing is that I don't see why people, instead of focusing that we have an easy language that's already being spoken from so many people in the world, and there are the movies, there is the music, these are big countries, both like England with the colonization, of course, if you add to it, and then the States. They make it even easier for us to learn English. And then instead of focusing on communication and connection, that is actually the fact that we can all speak English at one rapport makes it easier. We just focus on what? On the past? Past is gone. It's nice to remember your history. It's very important. And that's why I really believe that we should actually read, and no one reads anymore. And you, Jodah, you're wondering why Kundera is important. Because you need to know who you are and you need to understand how these people had to go through and their ideas, because it's the only way that we will not just make these mistakes, but we will get to understand ourselves faster and better. And I feel so sad that our brains are so fried up by the concepts of like productivity and be efficient that we really have to wonder if literature is important anymore. And there are people, young people, when I give lectures, that come to me and say, I don't read the novels. I find them a waste of my time. I only read leadership books. And what the fuck? Like, really? You really think that you don't need any context anymore? You really think that that's enough? You read the leadership book, and what are you going to do with it? Because frankly, I've learned so much more from literature than I've learned from any leadership book on the world. And the reason is that I can put these things into actual perspective. I can see how these things operated in a concept and the context that makes sense.
See, I need her to speak. Zoe, I need you to say everything that you just said and put it in front of my podcast, and I'll just run it as an intro, and then I'll just run the thing. Because like you basically just said, that's the entire conceit of my own podcast. That's the entire thing, is that, dear God, why... I say it at the beginning of all my Shorts episodes, because reading and understanding literature is better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book. Exactly. And I write business books. Like, give me a break. Don't try to understand mine. Go read Jane Austen if you want to understand emotional intelligence.
Maybe someone should write a series of novels. There's a business opportunity. Someone who goes and purposely writes a series of...
I do that. No. Did I tell you?
Okay, so you know where I'm going with this thought. Okay, all right.
I'm trying to write a book about burnout, and I also use comic elements and several other things.
Oh, I can't wait. So I'd love to hear more about that. Actually, what's your thinking around that?
Well, I actually collaborated with an author friend of mine who is also like my best friend. He's also a musician, an opera singer, and an awarded author. And the reason I did this collaboration wasn't because I didn't have the burnout knowledge. I mean, I'm the expert in burnout, and the book's about burnout. but I really needed someone to make sure that our book is going to maintain the novel style, and it's not going to be another self-help book. Yeah, I wanted to be sentimental. I wanted to have funny stories inside. I wanted to be a book that gives you the concept of burnout and how to deal with it, but it's not really a self-help book. And we even now collaborate with a cartoonist, so it's going to be very fun.
Oh, cool!
I'm excited. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's
stay tuned.
So I have one business. So remember, I'm going to be reductive on this one. I'm the critic, not the critic. I'm the cynic in this. I'm wearing the cynic hat. But everything I've heard so far makes complete sense. But sticking with my cynic, I am extracting some stuff out of this to think about organization. And your story, Zoe, made me think about the homogenization of thought, the reduction into jingoism, nationalism, and that really holds from a organization level, leadership level, that in itself will tend to probably hold you back. And one of the things I read about Milan Kundera in my recent trying to figure out who this gentleman was, is that he saw him because of his being an expatriate of Czechoslovakia and moving to France and feeling like that eternal sort of guest in his space, or trying to figure out negotiating what it means to be a foreigner. He thought his whole belief was the world would be better if you had as many types of people in a small space as possible. The idea of a homogenized Europe, a single sort of everybody has their own enclaves. He liked the idea of mixing it up. And I think there's stories. I think there's evidence suggests that even in organizations to have multiple groups together, and different types of people and ages and
diversity is important. We know that, right? Diversity of thought and experience.
Absolutely. And it reduces, and it helps reduce groupthink potentially. It will help reduce the homogenization of thought. And it's an obvious one, but that's one thing I'm gaining from your story, Zoe, to some degree, because you're seeing this homogenized group trying to defend and being ensconced in what they think is supposed to be static as opposed to moving forward. Greek won't sound like Greek. Ancient Greek has nothing to do with modern Greek, probably, with the exception of some rare words, I'm assuming. It's always going to change. And we need to be comfortable with that. And I think Milan kind of cultivated that notion, be comfortable with this change and constant novelty that will be introduced into your life. Tell me I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that particularly with the dominance of the United States culturally, since the end of World War II, there has been an immense pushback. And I think that's part of the reason why this sort of institutionalized amnesia is going on in Greek culture, because it's this vainglorious pushback attempt to deny a sort of monoculture, right? And Kundera was opposed to monoculture, like you said. He was opposed to this one-size-fits-all culture. But he was also an author. And so Zoe writes books. I've written books. Let me tell you something. Language means things. Words mean things. This is why I'm partisan for free speech. My God, particularly speech I disagree with, right? I need for disagreeable people to be able to talk as loudly and as often as possible, as much as possible in the open square. And there you go. Like, we're going to deal with it, right? We're going to get these ideas out there. We're going to float them around. We're going to have the fights verbally, and then we're all going to move on to something else. But fighting against that monoculture is what a lot of other other cultures do. And so you're seeing this sort of swing back and forth, right? Between the pushback against a monoculture, but then the desire to be nationalistic, or the desire to have something that's uniquely Greek or uniquely German or uniquely Ukrainian. Yes, I did pick that one on purpose. Or uniquely Swedish or whatever, right? Now, the X factor in all of this is, of course, social media, as Zoe has brought up, because the kid in Iowa can now see on Instagram Reels what's going on in Greece and can like and comment on it if he wants, or she.
Yeah. Don't take me wrong. I like the fact that there are multiple languages and that I really embrace different cultures. And I think that's important to maintain those cultures and maintain history. And I would never like that everyone is the same and we all become this Americanized one thing that is a result of pop culture. No, I would never. And I'm a very proud Greek, actually. But at the same time, like, move on. It shouldn't be your entire identity. it's one part of your identity. We are Greek, but at the same time, we can be citizens of the world. And at the same time, we get influenced by what's happening in the world. And sometimes that's Taylor Swift. And some other time it's a Czech, it's a Czech artist that died, and his name is like Milan Kundera. And that should be about it. That's what it really means to be a cultivated person with culture, getting elements from everywhere, and then creating a unique identity that is a result of all these different elements that you've picked up around.
Well, and we don't have. So Tony Bennett died today, right? That'll date this podcast. That guy was 96 years old. Milan Kundera was 94. These guys lived almost an entire century. The level of influence that they had because of the actual talent that they evinced and that they put out into the world is undeniable. You can't get away from that. And at the same time, there's another thread that's going on underneath this, which we have not touched on, but I think is hugely important, and that's globalization. And so globalization really kicked off in the with the Bretton Woods Agreement in the 1940s, but it really hit its peak in the 80s and in the 90s, right when Russia was, at least in its previous communist iteration, was receding, right? But now we're at the end of globalization. I know it may not look like that from Greece, but we're at the end of globalization. America is rapidly deglobalizing, reshoring, just at a manufacturing and at an industrial level, at a level that we haven't done in, good Lord, 50 years. It's all America come home, right? And partially that's because of Iraq and Afghanistan. The American public is incredibly resistant to going off on foreign adventures anymore. This is why we're giving money to the Ukraine rather than dumping bodies in there. And I don't think we are going to dump bodies in there.
Well, I mean, if we put bodies in Ukraine, there'd be World War III.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other dynamic too. Yeah, that's the other dynamic too. But even if Ukraine was in, like, let's say Iran, we're not. It's not happening because the appetite of the public isn't there. And again, you may not see this from other countries, but the appetite of the public, the average guy on the street, isn't there for that, right? There's going to be a clapback on that. So America's retreating. Well, when America retreats, look, geographically, we've got 2 oceans. We don't have to deal with any of y'all. Like, we just don't. We own a third of a continent and we're done. We're good to go. That gives us a certain level of hubris and arrogance. Don't get me wrong. That's a bad thing. But it also gives us this idea of being the shining city on the hill, to quote from Ronald Reagan. And when you deglobalize, then you become the thing that everybody wants to chase rather than the thing that is spreading out. I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic that's going to play out over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, with reverberations down to the things that Zoe's talking about, culture and all of that. Now, social media, well, everybody will get to see it live rather than happening on CNN. They'll just see it live happening in their TikTok feeds or wherever it is people will be going. I don't go to that neighborhood, so I don't know what's going on over there.
Hey, son, can I correct you? Didn't the Monroe Doctrine say that we have the entire continent plus the southern continent?
It did, yeah, but I'm keeping us in North America.
And Monroe just says you basically can't invade, a foreign country can't invade anything on the.
Yeah, it says everybody stay out.
Everybody stay out, exactly.
Stay out. But I think that's going to be really, really interesting. So that globalization peak hits in the, like I said, the 80s and the 90s. And we slowly begin to deleverage and deglobalize. And we're deleveraging and deglobalizing. And that's going to continue on for quite some time. Because it took a long time to put all that together. It's going to take a long time to pull all that apart. And that will allow various countries, particularly European countries, to begin to assert themselves. And that will shift culture, and that will shift cultural knowledge and cultural products around. And I think probably overall that's a good thing.
Well, it would be nice if Americans knew that other countries exist.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it would be nice. Other than Mexico and Canada. Other than Mexico and Canada.
That's the point. That's the point. I was going to say, you talk to people in the United States, they call themselves Americans.
Right.
And they forget Canadians are Americans.
Yeah.
Mexicans are Americans. But we've taken ownership of this terminology. And words, like you said, words matter. They're significant. They're signifiers. They also don't matter. They're fungible. You can throw it out if you want. But Americans take this thing where it's like they are the embodiment of this continent, when there's actually 2 other countries that are on this continent.
Yeah, and there's
actually
also
3.
the aspect of just not being aware of what's going on in the world too. I remember hanging out with lots of Spanish exchange students in college, and that was always their criticisms, like, the Americans don't read the international news page, right? So they're very self-focused and they don't know what's going on in the world. Like, for instance, last time we talked to Zoe, you were having an immigrant crisis with the boats, right?
Yeah,
You had made a reference to that. I don't watch a lot of news anymore lately for a lot of different reasons, but completely ignorant about that tragedy that was happening over there, and so again, we tend to be very myopic in the United States.
We have a tragedy right now. Did you hear about the fires? Half of Greece is burning again because of the heat wave. So the whole Europe is sending efforts to help us with they send firemen, they send helicopters. So it's a big thing. The country is under fire.
That goes back to the reality thing. I think Jesan's first statement about global warming or global climate change, that I think anybody who's slightly rational, I want to say that. Anybody who believes in certain evidence and certain potential facts will all agree that the climate's changing and things are getting hotter. It's undeniable that things are getting hotter. That's undeniable, right? That's reality. But the rationale as to why is up to anybody's opinion, depending on probably where you stand on politically. So there's belief imposed on reality saying, you know what, I'm actually going to fight this reality to some degree. So I think that's a good example of belief trumping reality to some degree.
I have an insane story I want to share since we started with Kundera, and I imagine we'll come to the end. So I saved an insane story for you guys, okay? So 11 years ago, I'm at a Greek island called Mytilene. I'm there with work, and it starts raining a bit. So I go under the roof to protect myself from the rain, and I'm holding the Unbearable Lightness of Being by Kundera. And the guy comes under the same roof, and he's holding the joke. So we start talking about Kundera, etc., etc. It was very nice. And yeah, that was it. I never saw him again. And our last week, the day Kundera died, I am at a tavern in another island, in Ikaria, random, in a tavern with my bestie. And we talk about stuff. And I hear a voice. And it's like, Zoe? And I look around. And it's that guy. What are the odds on the exact day that Kundera died? Awesome. 11 years after I saw that guy. And he sat with us and we talked a bit. It was nice. And there are two things that I realized after this talk and after this event. 3 things. Okay, one is the power of coincidence and serendipity, which always seems to be like, I have a very rational brain. So I'm always like, wow, that's extra. So the second thing is that this would never happen to me again. And do you know why?
Why?
Well, I got a Kindle. So I was like, back in the day, I could socialize with my books. No. And the third thing I thought is that, Kundera is actually a personality trait. Like, if you see someone reading Kundera, you can assume stuff about their personality. It makes sense to talk to that person. And that's big.
Oh, interesting.
Because how many things can you say that about? I hanged out with that person under the rain, and now 11 years later, we hanged out together and still had things to say. I laughed a lot. It made sense. But then, I don't know, I have a Mini Cooper, but I would never go and start a discussion with someone who has a Mini Cooper.
I know someone who would.
Right.
I know someone who would do that. I actually know.
Well, I think you used to have a Mini Cooper, Jodah.
No, I never did, but I know somebody who totally had like this affinity with anybody else with a Mini Cooper, and they would pull him over and have a conversation with them.
I want to go back to a
comment.
My
person. That's not my guy.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what Zoe said, because I think it would be a good closing question. So you say, if you see somebody with a Milan Kundera book, there's certain attributes about that person you can infer about that person because they're reading Milan Kundera. So let's maybe go around and think about what those attributes are, and then we can kind of start closing out the show. So Zoe, what are the attributes of a Milan Kundera reader?
Well, the thing is that if you really are a Milan Kundera reader, and it's not just that somebody told you about this book, so you just opened 5 pages and that was it. If you're actually a reader,
Jodah,
then
you mean like Jodah?
Then you have a perspective in life. In order to sustain his book, you have a perspective in life that's what I would say half broken, and that's for me is interesting. It's broken in the sense of this is where the light comes through. from these cracks that I have in my soul. That's where the light comes through. And that's something interesting for me. Yeah, that's something that I know that this person gets it. They've been through stuff, but this stuff, they don't let them characterize them. Otherwise, they wouldn't understand what he's writing about. They wouldn't care.
Yeah. And we bonded over Milan Kundera in our first episode with you, right? Exactly. That was like one of the first questions. We started talking about Milan, and I was like, oh, okay, I like Zoe. Hey, San, what are the attributes of a Milan Kundera reader?
I think the biggest attribute of a Milan Kundera reader is that if I see somebody walking with that book, I can probably presume that they have a lack of historical amnesia. They're actually historically aware. That's probably the biggest assumption. And then the next one is that they're not cynical. I wrote this down, and Zoe said this, has been taking notes while Zoe's been talking because there's so much good stuff here. But they're not cynical in a Charles Bukowski kind of way, right? But they're cynical in a different kind of way, right? It's more like a lighthearted sort of cynicism there. And then the third thing is they are a person who is aware and cognizant of the impact of the absurd. So we just covered the myth of Sisyphus on our podcast, the Albert Camus book. And, he talks about absurdity, suicide, those kinds of things in that book. And Kundera, instead of going in the direction of suicide being logical, Kundera went in the direction of sexual promiscuity being the logical outcome, the pursuit of pleasure, basically, being the logical outcome of absurdity. But Camus, when he was laying out existential philosophy in the myth of Sisyphus and justifying suicide, would probably have been fine with pleasure too, because those two principles, pleasure and pain, are the two, to Zoe's point and to other folks here who have said this today, they're the two realest things that you can experience, right? And so I would assume that someone who has that book is exploring that absurdity and is open to having those kinds of conversations.
And I'll say an appreciation of playfulness, to your point, and lightness, to the point of unbearable lightness of being, that dichotomy between the heavy things that are weighing you down and how do we get to that lighter place in our reality. And again, I think going back to context too, an appreciation of the context in which our behaviors emerge because of the world that we live in, which is definitely informed by his experience under a totalitarian regime in Czechoslovakia. Jodah?
I think
I'm the last word.
I'm looking
at
three of them.
So that's the ending.
I don't know.
Last word on this conversation. Jodah, did we convince you of anything?
So, first off, yes, you have convinced me. What I think I've been convinced of mostly is that being someone inside a team, a group, an organization, a leader, looking at it in such a myopic way is folly. And you have to realize that's in context of something much bigger. And Milan Kundera looks at the bigger context. And so it's not always about, as like Zoe or Jesan were saying, the specific book on how the 7 habits of successful people. You need to broaden your thinking, your mind, and learn lessons about life in general, because it all cascades down into your daily habits of wherever you're doing. And so, nice. Yes, you've convinced me.
Great. We won. Where can people find you?
I have a website, fragou.com, and super active on LinkedIn. And if you want to see the beauties of Greece, I post a lot of Greek beaches and islands on my Instagram. So I'm real Greek, guys.
Nice.
Greek and proud.
Despite what the nationalists say.
I had my doubts.
I've seen your pictures. Your pictures are very beautiful. That's a lovely landscapes out there in Greece.
Thank you so much.
So I don't know. You can find me on all the places you find podcasts. Listen to the leadership lessons from the great books on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts. Used to be on Stitcher. Now it's SiriusXM, Pandora, iHeartRadio. Deezer, for those of you who are in Europe, who are listening to this, who are European folks. You can get that on Deezer or Ghana even, or the Giro Network in India. By the way, our podcast ranks number 1 in the leadership and philosophy area in India. And we've been ranking number 1 for like the last 3 or 4 months. So we want to keep that going.
Congratulations.
And then you can also pick up my book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, co-written with Bradley Madigan, available everywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle. You walk around, look smart. Buy that book, walk around,
Maybe
look
we'll
smart.
strike up a conversation.
I will not buy it on my Kindle.
Carrying it around.
No, don't buy it on your Kindle.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for being on the show. Make sure to reach out to Jesan and Zoe, get Jesan's book, and tune into the Leadership Lessons podcast.
Yep.
Take care,
Love y'all.
everybody.
Laters.
Bye.